Your house is lying to you. Every wall, every window, every thermostat you've adjusted has been selling you a version of warmth that costs more, delivers less, and was designed by people with a financial reason to make sure you could never be fully warm without paying them again next month. But there was a man deep in the mountains of western North Carolina who built something so thermally efficient that the people who laughed at him ended up standing outside in a blizzard, burning through their firewood in 2 days while he sat warm with a fire no bigger than what you'd cook beans on. Three blizzards came that winter. When the third one broke, only his shelter stood ready. His name was Atohi. His people called it the Asi. What he knew about warmth, we threw away for a lie. Picture the scene. It is the late 1880s, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains of what is now western North Carolina. The eastern band of Cherokee had already survived things that should have broken them entirely. Forced removal, civil war, the systematic theft of their land and their language and their children. They were still here, quiet, rooted, and Atohi was old by then, old enough to remember when the ISI was simply what every family built before the first hard frost, when no one questioned it, when the knowledge lived in the hands of grandmothers and uncles and sat as naturally in the body as the knowledge of how to walk or how to read a ridgeline for weather. He wasn't a famous man. He held no title the settlers around him would have recognized. He didn't write anything down, but he understood something about the relationship between earth and cold air and heat that most structural engineers alive today have never been required to learn, and it showed in every decision he made before winter arrived. Watch what he did. He didn't start with walls. He started with a hole. He dug down into the hillside, several feet deep, choosing a slope that turned its back to the prevailing winter wind. Then he bent green poles, freshly cut, still supple and willing, into a dome frame, driving their bases deep into the packed earth around the pit's perimeter. He wove river cane between those poles horizontally, layer after layer, until the whole surface felt like a basket turned inside out. Then came the plaster, a thick, heavy mixture of red clay, dried river grass, and ash, pressed by hand into every gap, built up in coats, smoothed until the wall was dense and continuous and held no memory of the seams beneath it. The roof was built the same way and finished with more than half a foot of that clay mixture, packed tight from base to crown. From a distance, the finished structure looked less like a house and more like something the earth had grown. The entrance was cut low, barely the height of a child on, and it didn't go straight in. It bent, a curved passageway that made the cold air change direction before it ever reached the living space. Inside, a small central fire pit, no windows, no gaps, nothing a February wind could find and push through. When the neighboring settlers watched it taking shape, they shook their heads. It was dark. It was small. It looked like a burial mound, not a home. One man said you'd suffocate in there before morning. Another said it was no better than an animal den. Atohi said nothing back. He had heard all of it before. He kept building. So, what did he know that the men laughing at him didn't? What does a structure that looks like a hill understand about surviving a blizzard that a frame house with glass windows doesn't? That question is what the rest of this video answers. But before we get there, I need to ask you something directly. Have you ever been inside a house during a bad winter storm and still felt cold? Not freezing, just that low, persistent chill that wraps around your ankles and settles into your lower back, no matter how high you turn the heat. The kind of cold that makes you feel like you're fighting the season from inside your own home and losing. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you live and what winter does to your walls, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about warmth, about shelter, about what it means for a building to actually work. Let's talk about what your house is actually doing in winter. The average modern home, whether it's a stick-frame suburban build from the 1990s or a mid-rise apartment with forced air heating, does something architecturally remarkable in its mediocrity. It fights the cold from the outside while bleeding heat from every surface simultaneously. Consider the standard exterior wall assembly: a half-inch of drywall on the inside, a cavity stuffed with fiberglass batt insulation rated somewhere between R13 and R21, a layer of OSB sheathing, a sheet of house wrap, and then whatever siding the builder chose for the lowest price per square foot. Sounds thorough. Sounds like a system, but that entire assembly sits fully exposed to wind on its outer face, and wind does not politely wait outside. Wind drives cold air through every electrical outlet box, every window frame gap, every place where two different materials meet and expand at slightly different rates when the temperature drops. You are paying your heating bill largely to replace heat that the building itself is constantly handing back to the outside world. Now, consider your floor. Most American homes sit over either a vented crawl space or a concrete slab. Both are extraordinarily effective cold conductors. The cold doesn't just sit under there. It radiates upward steadily all night long. You put on socks to cope with it. Your heating system runs longer cycles to compensate for it. You call that normal. It is not normal. It is the entirely predictable consequence of building codes and construction economics that prioritize speed and material cost over thermal performance, written largely during an era when heating fuel was cheap enough that efficiency seemed like an unnecessary refinement. Here's where it gets worse. The modern homes that perform best thermally, the passive house builds, the heavily insulated new construction, require mechanical ventilation systems because when you seal a building that tightly with synthetic materials, the air inside becomes stale and moisture accumulates toward mold. So, the solution to the problem created by the original design flaw generates a brand new mechanical dependency. You are now paying for a ventilation system to solve a problem that wouldn't exist if the building had been designed with the earth and the climate in mind from the very beginning. Atohi didn't need a ventilation system. He had a smoke hole at the crown of his dome, and it worked in perfect harmony with the central fire below it. Warm air rose and carried smoke out. Cool, fresh air was drawn in low through the entrance passage, and the interior breathed like a living thing, rather than gasping behind sealed drywall. Now, here is the part that should make you genuinely angry. The disappearance and traditional Cherokee building knowledge from North American architecture was not a natural evolution. It was not the market selecting a better product. It was policy, deliberate, documented, federally funded policy. From the late 1700s onward, U.S. government assimilation programs explicitly targeted indigenous architecture as a symbol of cultural inferiority to be replaced. Indian agents and Christian missionaries promoted European log cabins and frame houses, not because they performed better in mountain winters. They didn't. They performed significantly worse, but because living in a European-style house was framed as evidence of civilization. The Asi was called primitive, dirty, uncivilized. Families who had sheltered comfortably through Appalachian winters for more than 1,000 years were told to be ashamed of the very structures that had kept them alive. And because the pressure was immense and the penalties for resistance were devastating, they stopped building them. Within 2 generations, the knowledge chain was so thoroughly severed that when the Cherokee Heritage Center attempted to reconstruct a traditional village in the modern era, their builders had nothing to work from but post-hole patterns in archaeological digs and fragmentary written descriptions left by 18th century European visitors who had never bothered to understand what they were looking at. The knowledge didn't fade. It was taken, systematically, on purpose. And here is what you need to hear clearly. Your house isn't failing because you made a bad choice. It's failing because the standards that built it were designed around profit, not performance. That is not on you. Let's go layer by layer through what Atohi actually built and why each decision was a precise thermal solution to a specific problem. Layer 1, the earth, the single most underestimated thermal resource available anywhere in a cold climate, is the ground beneath your feet. By digging several feet into that hillside and using the excavated pit as his floor and lower walls, Atohi was connecting his shelter directly to one of the most stable heat sources on the planet, below the frost line, which in the southern Appalachians runs roughly 3 to 4 feet down. Ground temperature holds remarkably steady throughout the winter months, often between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air temperature is doing above ground. Think of it like this. Instead of your house sitting on top of a cold surface it constantly loses heat to, Atohi's shelter was cradled inside a surface that gave gentle heat back around the clock. His floor was not a liability. It was a passive radiator that never stopped working and never sent him a bill. The earth was doing continuous thermal work that required not a single piece of firewood. Layer 2, the walls. Wattle and daub sounds primitive right up until you understand what it is actually doing at a physical level. The river cane, woven horizontally between the structural poles, created thousands of small trapped air pockets distributed throughout the wall matrix. And still air that cannot move, that is captured inside a structure and held, is one of the finest insulators that exists in nature. This is the same principle behind down insulation in a winter jacket, behind the double pane window, behind every modern insulation product you've ever seen advertised. The mechanism is identical. The Cherokee were using it in their walls centuries before anyone filed a patent on it. Then, the clay plaster sealed those air pockets inside the wall and added something modern fiberglass insulation almost entirely lacks: thermal mass. Thermal mass is the ability of a dense, heavy material to absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. Your drywall has almost no thermal mass. It heats quickly, cools quickly, and the moment your furnace cycles off, the warmth disappears almost immediately. Layer 3, the roof and the snow. More than half a foot of packed clay and grass mixture on top of the dome meant the roof functioned thermally the same way the earthen floor did, as dense, insulating mass that absorbed heat and released it slowly. But here is where the design reveals something almost beautiful in its cleverness. Snow didn't melt off that roof rapidly. It accumulated on the curved clay surface and built up, and snow is itself one of the most effective natural insulators known. Its crystalline structure traps air between the flakes in the same way the woven cane trapped air inside the walls. The snow piling onto the roof of the ASI during a blizzard was not a structural threat. It was an additional insulating layer, automatically applied by the storm itself. The structure became more thermally protected the worse the weather got. That is not luck. That is 1,000 years of watching how winter behaves and building in response to it. Layer 4, the entrance. A doorway is the most thermally vulnerable point in any shelter. Modern buildings address this with weather stripping, door sweeps, insulated steel doors, and storm doors. Layer after layer of products attempting to solve a problem that Atohi's people had already solved architecturally. The curved, low entrance passage created a buffer zone, what architects today call a thermal vestibule, though they rarely acknowledge where the principle originated. Cold air is dense and heavy. It sinks, it pools near the ground. The angled passageway made the incoming cold air travel a longer path, change direction, lose momentum, and warm slightly before it could reach the living space. The warm interior air, lighter and rising, stayed above it. No product required. No maintenance required. Physics handled it because the structure was designed to work with physics rather than against it. Layer 5, the fire itself. This is where the surviving historical records become genuinely remarkable. James Adair, a trader who spent 40 years living and working among southeastern tribes in the 1700s and left one of the most detailed ethnographic accounts of that era, described the Cherokee winter house as being like a Dutch oven, a small blaze, barely what most people would call a real fire, or even a handful of coals, was sufficient to keep the interior warm on the coldest nights. He wrote this with audible bewilderment. How could so little fire produce so much warmth? Because the fire was the last layer of a complete system, not the whole system. The earth was contributing. The walls were contributing. The roof was contributing. The entrance passage was contributing. The fire was the finishing touch on a structure that had already done most of the thermal work before a single stick was lit. So, if this method was so effective, why did it disappear? Three reasons. And they first, speed. An ASI required knowledge that lived in human hands, specific materials gathered and prepared with care, and a community working together over multiple days. A log cabin could be thrown up by one family in a weekend with nothing more than an axe and some nails. When settlers were pushing into Cherokee territory and assimilation pressure was at its height, the entire value system had shifted away from knowledge and towards speed. The traditional structure didn't fit the timeline. Second, economic replacement. Government assimilation programs weren't funding the construction of traditional houses. They were funding log cabins and frame houses, training Cherokee people in European construction techniques as an explicit cultural replacement strategy. The money flowed toward the wrong method and away from the right one. The economics buried what the climate validated. Third, cheap fuel created the illusion that efficiency no longer mattered. Cast iron wood stoves arrived in the mid-1800s and could make even a poorly insulated cabin survivable. When coal and cut wood were cheap, burning more to compensate for a leaky building felt like a reasonable trade-off. It seemed reasonable for a century. But that century is over. Energy costs what it costs now. The climate is doing what it's doing now. And passive thermal efficiency, building with the earth, building with mass, building with the geometry of cold air, looks less like a primitive relic with every passing winter. The hidden costs they never counted? Dependence, total multi-generational financial dependence on external energy sources. The AISI required no monthly payment, no delivery truck, no grid connection, no utility company. Once built, it sustained itself on the thermal energy of the earth and the smallest possible fire. When the grid goes down, and in Cherokee Nation territory during February 2021, it went down for over a week. Across thousands of homes, the people living in a properly built traditional structure don't call anyone. They put a few small sticks on the coals and they wait for spring. So what do you actually do with this knowledge? Here are 3 entry points, ordered from simplest to most involved. The first and easiest step. Atohi was not a primitive man living a primitive life. He was an engineer working with zero-cost materials, guided by principles that had been tested, refined, and perfected across more than 1,000 years of Appalachian winters. And he understood the thermodynamics of shelter with a depth and an intuition that most modern architects are never required to develop. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was taken, stripped away by policy, buried under a system that needed you cold enough and dependent enough to keep paying. If this changes how you see the gap between what indigenous knowledge understood and what we were told was progress, hit subscribe, because this is exactly what this channel exists to uncover. Every week, we dig up practices, materials, and methods that were working long before the industries built to replace them ever existed. And drop a comment below. What forgotten knowledge, what dismissed tradition, what practice that got labeled backward or outdated do you want us to investigate next? We are listening, and we are just getting started.